Welcome back, my favorite Tzaddik and Chassidim. Hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to be looking at some content from the notorious evangelical organization in Israel that is one against Israel, one for Israel, quote unquote. Now, this is one of the biggest missionary organizations that are targeting Jews in particular, and they are fastly growing. They've become famous in the past few years. And so, in this video today, I wanted to address some of their content, and hopefully that my responses to these will be representative of my responses toward a lot of their other content. So let's jump into this first clip here.
Here's what you need to do. You've got to first shave your head. You dress all in black. You've got to wear a white robe.
Wow, we are already off to a horrible start, really. Why is this the case? It's because none of those things are mandatory. Those things are only part of cultural haredut, right? It's a very particular sect or movement or perspective within a very particular set of the Jewish world. And none of it actually comes from halacha. The halacha, so the oral law, never says that a person has to shave his head, never says that he has to wear a white robe, never says that he has to do any of these things, like dress in black and white and wear a hat and wear a jacket. None of these things are mandatory. And yet he's positing these things as if like that's what the rabbinic Jews expect us to do. No, none of these things are mandatory. And partly how I know this is because these things are not expected even at my own congregation, which is Orthodox. And you'll find within the non-Haredi world, none of these things are actually expected, right? So maybe he's coming from the Haredi world, or maybe he was born in Hasidish, right? And the Hasidim are part of the Haredi world. So maybe this is what he has in mind. But when he says that these things are, to be expected, it's like, okay, go to some other, join some other community, you start going to a different shul. If you don't like the cultural aspects, then go somewhere else, right? Go where you fit in.
Eat only kosher foods.
Okay, now that part is actually biblical. See, it's not part of cultural Judaism, quote unquote. This is actually coming from the Bible. Well, let's continue.
You've got to become a vegetarian. You face Jerusalem. You've got to face India when you pray. You pray only in Hebrew, and you grow a nice big beard. And if you do all of those outward cultural things, you'll discover the God of the universe.
Wow, so there's a lot to unpack here. So you mentioned vegetarianism, facing Jerusalem, and then facing India. I'm guessing that he means facing east, and India's in the east. But I mean, like Russia's in the east, China's in the east. You go far enough, America's in the east, right? Just keep going east, right? The east of the east. We're more eastern than China. So I'm guessing that this is what he's referring to. Now, when it comes to Jewish vegetarianism, and some Jews are vegetarians, and many others are not. The vast majority of Jews are not. So I'm not sure why he's claiming that a person has to be vegetarian, and that's a new one for me. I mean, first of all, it's not a bad way to go. I was vegetarian for almost 8 years, and by looking at me, you would never guess that I was. But so I'm back on meat, and no weight has changed. But vegetarianism, I think, is a great way to go, but it's not expected. Nobody expects you to be vegetarian. Now, regarding facing Jerusalem when we pray, I mean, again, that's not part of the oral law, so to speak, but that's something that King Solomon himself instituted. It's in 1 Kings 8:29, where he's building the temple and he completes the temple. And when he's dedicating the temple and it's the inauguration ceremony and everybody's all excited and they're all gathered there to witness the unveiling of the temple, King Solomon says, "And no matter where the Jewish people are scattered, let them face this house and pray to you, O God." Right? This is that's not a quotation, by the way, but if you look up the verse, this is what it says. Right? 1 Kings 8:29. And so King Solomon is the one who told us to pray toward the temple, wherever we go. It doesn't mean that you can't pray anywhere else. Right? I pray all the time, not facing the temple. But when we're doing the prayers from the Siddur, the prayer book, right, there are certain prayers that do need to be said facing the temple. All other prayers that you can think of, imagine that you want to recite, you can do it with your back toward the temple if you wanted to. Not that you necessarily should. But the point is that you can pray them wherever you want. You don't have to pray every single prayer. toward the temple. There are only certain ones that do.
And I'm thinking this is crazy that someone thinks that they can force their culture on God and that God's going to be impressed by what you wear, what direction you face when you pray, what you eat, and all these sorts of things.
Again, with the exception of eating kosher and with the possible exception of facing the temple when we daven certain prayers, all the rest of those things are entirely cultural. Nobody says that you have to do them as a matter of religious law. They are just simply the practices of certain communities, right? And if you're going to be part of those communities, then you should fit in. You shouldn't be, wearing hot fluorescent pink suits or something, or sticking out for no reason. But you should adapt to where you are, right? Even Jews are told this when they go to other Jewish communities, that if you're going to be living in another community for an extended period of time, then you need to adapt to the practices of that particular community, no matter where you come from, right? So if you're a Haredi and you go and live in the Sephardic world for a little bit, you're actually expected to keep their minhag, their custom. Now, this isn't often done nowadays because people are kind of sticks in the mud and they just want to stick to how they were brought up or what's familiar. And, in some instances that may be good. However, technically, the halacha does say that you need to conform to the community of where you live. And if you're living somewhere, even temporarily, if you're living there for a few months, let's say, you need to adapt to that community. And so it's not a matter of religious law. Oh, if you wear, all black and white, and if you wear a hat and you grow a long beard, you don't have to grow a long beard. There are rabbis in the Talmud who shaved, right? And so for him to put this up as if it's like some standard of rabbinic Judaism, ooh, rabbinic, as if there's really any other kind of Judaism, when he's putting this up as, oh, look at these extremists. Oh, they're trying to force our culture on God. Nobody's trying to force their culture on God. That doesn't make any sense, right? And nobody's trying to impress God. Ask any Jew, are you trying to impress God? And you'll get weird looks and people will laugh at you like, what are you talking about? We're doing mitzvahs because he told us to do mitzvahs. We're not doing it to impress God. Like, what does that even mean?
It seemed to me that if there was a God out there who could be known,
Well, that's where you went wrong, is it seems to me, right? Whenever you start contradicting the Bible and you go according to it seems to me, you're going to have problems. You're not going to have a good day.
he should be able to be recognized no matter where I face, no matter how I'm dressed, because he's God. Growing up, we always understood that we had our Bible and the Gentiles had their Bible, the New Testament, and that they were two completely separate books. Because the only people I knew who were believers in Jesus were all people in our public school who were Italian Catholic, I imagined that Jesus was Italian. And so the understanding that he's actually Jewish was a shock. And then to hear that the New Testament was written by Jews, I couldn't believe it.
Well, you don't have to believe it. Now, there's plenty of literature that is written by Jews. It doesn't mean that the content of what they're writing is Jewish. For example, the Communist Manifesto was written by a Jew, Karl Marx. Not particularly a fan of that Jew. I'll take Jesus over Marx any day. And not being messianic, I hope that that's not causing any controversy. But my point being is that is plenty of literature written by Jews that is completely not kosher, completely taifa, that is not good for religious study. Now, what are the implications for the New Testament? Well, his argument is that because it was written by Jews, it must be good. And of course, there's no logical basis for this connection, right? But look, he's approaching this emotionally through, it seems to me, ism, and he's not approaching this through rigorous study and with logic. And by logic, I'm not saying, oh, whatever I agree with. By logic, I'm referring to the formal principles of logic. There are rules in logic. Logic is a science. And if he would be appealing to the science of logic, then he would find that his arguments are, well, kind of silly.
My expectation was that the New Testament was like my grandparents had told me. It was a book on how to persecute the Jews, and something you should stay away from. Of course, when you're told you should stay away from something, curiosity gets the best of you, and you've got to see it. When I opened the New Testament, I was expecting to find a handbook on how to persecute the Jews. My grandparents had warned me that it was written by people who killed the Jews.
Now, as we'll see, he actually starts to make a decent point, and it's that the New Testament is not about Jew persecution. It's not about hating the Jews. It's not about these things. Uh, I think that any thoughtful reader, I think even Tovia Singer, who I have great respect for, I don't necessarily agree with him on everything, but he generally makes good points, that the New Testament is not a training manual for Christian jihad, right? It's not, for Christian ISIS or something. What the New Testament is, it's essentially a story combined with systematic theology. And so, what happened throughout the course of time, and even very early on, we're talking the 100s and 200s, very early on, the Christians took this, they took these texts, and they used them to defend really bad beliefs. One of those really bad beliefs being that they needed to persecute the Jews, right? And there are sometimes no better examples of this than Martin Luther and John Calvin that said, throw the Jews in their synagogues and burn down the building, or that Jews need to be persecuted unendingly, right? This is what John Calvin said, the founder of the Baptist Church, essentially, right? People will be like, no, he wasn't. Okay, I get it, but he was the founder of Calvinism, and Baptists like Calvinism. Okay, there's enough of a connection here. I know that Zwingli and the others were also involved, but that's neither here nor there. My point being is that the founders of the Protestant churches were huge anti Semites, and the founders of the Catholic Church were huge anti Semites. And we can point to certain passages here or there that are not, or that seem friendly toward Jews, or oh well, Augustine defended the Jews. Well, yeah, but he was saying, don't murder the Jews. We need them to stick around to prove our theology right. And we need to make sure that they're poor and destitute forever, because then our theology will be manifestly correct to the rest of the world. Right? It's sick. Unfortunately, this is the kind of Christianity that One for Israel espouses. Now, they're not going to admit this, and maybe a lot of them don't even realize this. But this is the tradition that they're trying to spread in the world, particularly in Israel.
That's what I was expecting to see, and yet when I'm opening it, I'm reading a story written by Jews about Jewish people. The New Testament was a fascinating book. And so as I opened this book in the library, I kind of looked around, made sure that none of my friends had seen me taking a Christian Bible off the shelf. And I open it, here's the first sentence. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So 3 people are mentioned, and they're all Jewish. I was very shocked. And as I continued to read, I'm reading the story of a Jewish man who was born in a Jewish village, in a Jewish country.
Okay, that's great, but that could also apply to so many, literally a few million other Israelis, like in modern Israel today, and they're all secular atheists. So who cares about that? Who cares what your DNA is? What matters is who you are spiritually. What matters is your religion, your faith, your relationship to God. It doesn't matter if your grandparents were these great chachamim, if your great great grandfather was the chief rabbi of Ashdod or something, or Lublin or of Paris or wherever. It doesn't matter where you came from per se. What matters is who you are and who you choose to be. What matter are your choices, not your defaults, right? Your genetics are part of your default programming. Your ancestors are your default. You inherit them. You're born with them. You don't have any choice. And yet, so many of these people who are totally spiritually bereft, they take pride in the things that they had no control over and things that they had no choice over. They take pride in their Jewish ancestry and Jewish ethnicity, which is great, if it's coupled with also accepting the Jewish religion. not adopting some other foreign religion. And I know that his argument is that Christianity is not foreign. But the point is, because he's saying, oh, it's this incredibly Jewish thing, but look at his arguments. Don't be led away by the emotional and psychological manipulation. Read his words in the transcript or listen to his words. Don't be swept away by the emotion, only his words. And his words are baseless, right? There's no point to them. They're vain, like saying, oh, he was a Jew who was born in Israel. Millions of Jews are born in Israel, and they're all secular atheists. So who cares?
And one day walks into a synagogue and announces that he is the Messiah.
That's great, but guess who also did that? Shimon Bar Kokhba. And Christians don't think that he's the Messiah, right? And of course, there's reasons, and sometimes they're good reasons. Like, he didn't fulfill all the prophecies. It's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point, is that you have to fulfill the prophecies in order to be considered the Messiah, right? And that's the biggest Jewish complaint against the Christians, is that they're accepting someone as Mashiach without evidence, right? That he didn't fulfill everything, and yet he's still being accepted as Mashiach, right? It's not some great sin to think that somebody's Mashiach. It just happens to be wrong, right? And you can be a righteous person who is wrong, right? It's totally possible. However, it's obviously better to be a righteous person who is right, right?
The more I read the words of Jesus, the more I became attracted to him. It was as beautiful as anything I had ever read in any other part of the Bible.
We're going to skip over the fact that he just called the New Testament part of the Bible, because that's a whole other issue in itself. First of all, Jesus, the apostles, the disciples, Paul, whatever you want to consider him, none of them thought that the New Testament was part of the Bible, in part because of this very annoying fact that the New Testament didn't exist yet. So there was nothing to read. There was nothing to include as part of the Bible. There was nothing to add to the Bible, right? They were Jewish Jews who used the Jewish Bible. That's it. And I'm not here to be some giant Jesus apologist here, but you can find beauty in Jesus's teachings, or you can say these are all just Jewish teachings. And of course, Judaism is beautiful. That's kind of why we're here, is to promote the beauty and truth of Judaism, right? It's like, it's in the channel description. That's what we're literally here for. And the fact that this Jew is being attracted to Jewish beauty, well, is this really a surprise? Right? But when you start to see Jesus as something distinct from his own religion, rather than being an element of it and being part of it, as being a practitioner of it, a believer in it, a member of it, this is the interesting fact that Jesus was never actually excommunicated. He was never placed in cherem, whereas other people were. There were other false messiahs like Shabbatai Tzvi, Yimach Shmoi, that were placed in cherem, but Jesus never was. And so he's still technically part of the group here, and he's probably going to stay that way for eternity, I'm guessing. So given this, he's still a Jew, of course. He was a religious Jew, but contrary to the whole ministry of One Against Israel, he was not anti-rabbinic, and that's why nobody had a problem with him. They might have had a problem with his tactics. They might have had a problem with him getting more notoriety than them, right? For like petty personal reasons. But in terms of his teachings, you don't find people criticizing his teachings in the New Testament.
As I came to faith that Yeshua, that Jesus was the Messiah, it was clear that that was the most Jewish thing I could do.
I've heard this argument, and I think it started with Jews for Jesus back in the 60s or 70s, where accepting Jesus as the Messiah is the most Jewish thing that you can do. And I've never understood this argument. It's like eating kosher is not the most Jewish thing you could do. Like observing Pesach, the Passover, or Rosh Hashanah, or like wearing tzitzis, or putting tefillin, or saying some brachas before you eat or do other mitzvahs, or like obeying the Bible's not the most Jewish thing you could do. I mean, maybe complaining or debating, but I say this with absolute love because I do both all the time. But still, like, accepting Jesus as the Messiah is the most Jewish thing you can do. Based on what? It doesn't make any sense. Like, just think about this. Don't be led away by the rhetoric. How is it true? What is the claim being based on? And people they skip over it because it's like there's too many things to address. It's like, okay, whatever. That's just their rhetoric. It's just their propaganda. That's just what they say. But still, please explain to me how that's the most Jewish thing you can do. Not simply a Jewish thing, but the utmost, maximally Jewish thing that you can do. Please explain it to me.
This is not a person who's a renegade to our people. This is the one who was promised in our Bible, the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. It is astonishing. If you would just read that chapter, just without the Bible being around it, you would say, oh, this is some Christian Bible. This is Jesus.
Yeah, because this is something that has widely influenced all of Western culture, and most Jews lived in the West, at least after a certain point. Before that, they were living in the Middle East and North Africa. But still, when something is so culturally pervasive, of course that's going to be the first thing that comes to mind. We mentioned Karl Marx. It's like if somebody said communism, and you're told to think of communist thinkers or who founded communism, people are going to say Karl Marx. But guess what? It had been around for decades before that. Karl Marx didn't found communism. He founded a certain perspective on communism called Marxism. And that became the dominant way of thinking about communism, so that eventually it became synonymous with communism. And then Vladimir Lenin came along, and so then it became known as Marxism-Leninism. Don't ask me to say that 5 times fast. But still, whoever makes it famous, they become associated with it, right? And so if there's a certain passage in Tanakh that it's neither, obsessed over nor neglected, it's just kind of hanging out in the text. If there's a passage that one group doesn't focus on and another group really focuses on, that group's focus is going to eventually influence the first group, right? So that even when you talk about these concepts and you're just reading straight from Isaiah 53, if you're speaking to a Jew, even a religious Jew, who is not well educated in that passage, that's probably where they're going to, where their mind's going to go, where their train of thought's going to go. Because the culture has conditioned all of us into thinking in certain patterns, according to certain patterns, right? When people walk the path before us, it's easier just to walk down that path rather than be innovators and go our own way, right? Or to do the hard study and to find alternative understandings, right? So it's makes sense when you study history.
When you realize, though, that it's in the middle of our Bible, our Jewish Bible. When I first came to faith, I dared not tell my father, because this is a time period in the 1970s when there were lots of gurus and cults, and he was
I've maintained for a long time, not necessarily on this channel, but just in life. Wait, I have a life apart from YouTube? Yes, barely, but it does exist. I've maintained for a long time that evangelical missionaries, and it's usually them because even the word evangelical means you're a gospelite. You're a gospelarian, right? So their whole religion's founded on what they consider the gospel. And I say what they consider the gospel because there's lots of different perspectives, and even as an outsider reading the text, what they define as the gospel doesn't seem to be the case. Nonetheless, these evangelical missionaries, they go out, and a lot of the tactics that they use, I've always thought that they felt real salesy. Like they feel like salesmen, like used car salesmen, insurance salesmen. And know how I know that? In part because I did used to sell insurance. And the sales training reeked of a Sunday sermon. How? They spoke according to the same patterns, they used some of the same psychological and emotional tactics, and they'd throw God in once in a while, right? It felt just like a Sunday sermon, like I was back in church, y'all. So yeah, they're going to sound like a cult because they act like a cult. And it's because ultimately there are somewhat cultic aspects to the evangelical movement. And that doesn't mean that all evangelicals are within a cult mindset, but it does mean that certain corners of the evangelical world from which Jews for Judaism emerged, right? It was founded directly by the Baptist Church as a mission to the Jews. So within the evangelical world, there are in certain corners very culty dimensions to it. That's just a fact. So it's no wonder that your parents were alarmed, and that's the fact that you're leaving their faith to join another one. And yes, no matter how you defend it, oh, Jesus was a Jew born in Judea, even though millions of secular Jews are also born in Israel, right? I'm not saying that Jesus was a secular Jew, but my point being is that no matter where you're born or who you are, it doesn't matter. It matters what you do. And if you're teaching a Jesus that has come to abolish Judaism, of course your Jewish parents, your Jewishly Jewish parents, are going to be alarmed.
I was very concerned about me getting involved in some crazy sect and going off someplace. So I waited for months. And when I finally told him, he was very skeptical. On his own then, he started to read about Jesus as well. About a year and a half later, I told him that the fellow who wrote one of the books that he had read, that this fellow was giving a lecture in the city of New York. And he agreed to come out to hear that person. And one of the most amazing moments of my life was the speaker said, "Would everyone here who is a Jewish believer in Jesus, would you raise your hand?" And I raised my hand.
Here we go again. Another emotional manipulation tactic, right? Have you ever gone to a church? Yeah, I feel like I'm speaking to mostly Christians on air. You ever gone to a church and they have an altar call and they're playing the soft emotional music and you feel like you're in a dream and everything's very soft and quiet and it's like you're getting ready to get a massage or something, but you're not. There's no massage. There's just altar calls, and so they call everyone up to the front who wants to dedicate their life to Jesus. And so, the same people every week go up, and then you see somebody crying, and people are swaying, and their hands are up. And now, what does any of this have to do with the theological correctness of their teachings? Nothing. Nothing at all. Right? Because people get emotional, that has nothing to do with truth. As one famous Jew is known for saying, facts don't care about your feelings. And that is very, very true. And so by asking people to raise their hands, what is it doing? It's trying to promote a logical fallacy whereby you just accept things because they're popular. So if they can create the appearance, whether it's a true appearance or not, that something is popular, it will start to persuade people and start to move them. It won't necessarily convince them, but it will start to emotionally influence them and nudge them in the direction that the speaker wants. That when you can show that something is popular, at least within a certain setting or a community or whatever the situation is, if you can show that it's popular, then somebody can say, oh, I guess there's a lot of people that believe this. Well, they can't all be wrong. I've literally had people tell me this, that Christianity can't be wrong because so many people believe it. It's like you're not creative enough to imagine that a lot of people could be wrong, right? There's almost 2 billion Muslims in the world. You don't think that they're wrong? Oh, well, that's a false religion. Duh. Of course, right? And there's a few more Christians than Muslims, and so it's like, you don't think that they could also be on the wrong track? I mean, even Jesus himself said the gate's narrow. I don't think that 2 billion people are going to be going through a narrow gate.
My father also raised his hand. And I looked over and I said, Pop, he didn't say would all the Jews raise their hand. He said, would all the Jewish believers in Jesus raise their hand? And my father looked over and he said, yes, I heard what he said. The decision to come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah was not something that was a momentary lark. It wasn't something that was a passing fad. And I could see changes in myself that I knew were not from within myself. I had kind of tapped in to a truth for our Jewish people that was very powerful.
And it's funny, in the previous portion of my commentary here, I talked about how during altar calls they'll play soft, gentle, emotional music in order to stimulate feelings. And so this is exactly why they do it. And you can ask any pastor or the director of services for a larger church, and they'll tell you that. They'll say that it's to relax people and to make them more contemplative, and which leads to them being emotional. And people are more likely to make spur of the moment decisions when they're feeling emotional rather than thinking logically, right? Because the logical person, the thoughtful person, says, I'm going to consider this outside of the current environment that I'm in so that I can judge this whole thing, the whole situation, the teachings, the whatever, in a more objective manner, right? It's like, imagine if they had voter registration drives at political campaigns or conventions. Like, if you can sign people up to vote for your candidate at the convention itself, that's going to be far wildly more effective than saying, here, listen to the speech, and then a week from now, go to this website and register to vote and also vote for us, right? It's a key aspect of sales ideology or sales philosophy, I guess would be the better word, that you want to not only assume the sale, but get the customer, potential customer, to make the purchase right then and there. Don't think about it, because everybody knows statistically they are less likely to buy whatever product you're selling after you leave their house or after you leave the encounter with them, right? You can look this up yourself. It's part of sales psychology. That's the word that I was thinking of, psychology, not ideology or philosophy. But it's part of sales psychology where they train you to make the sale in the moment. Don't wait, make it today. It's like those old infomercials, only for the next 10 minutes, call today and get two for free. It's like they're trying to provoke people to act emotionally rather than thinking with their brains, their wonderful God given brains, their minds that God gave them in order to make good decisions. Emotions do not lead to good decisions usually. It doesn't mean they can't, it just means they typically don't. Right? So it's our job to be using our brains, right? As it says in the Jewish Bible, come, let us reason together. Right? Faith is still important, emotions are still important, and they're valuable, but they are the slaves of rationality, of reason, of our minds that God gave us. He put the head above the heart for a reason, yes, both anatomically, but also in terms of priority, right? We need to maintain this. Now, if you recall, I was talking about altar calls and how they're playing the gentle, soft music in order to emotionally manipulate people, right? Now, of course, they're not going to describe it like this, but this is the end result. They're trying to soften people up in order to accept the message that was just preached. If you notice in this video, they had the cool, edgy music in the beginning when he was rebelling against his former religion, and then the soft, gentle music once he started coming to Jesus and he had faith in the Messiah, right? They played the gentle music. Go watch the video again, right? Go to One for Israel's, and can't believe I'm actually saying this. Go to their page and watch the original video. You'll see how they use music to influence people emotionally and psychologically. If you don't think this is possible, look it up for yourself. Music does influence people. Anyway, this wraps up our take on One for Israel's nonsense for today. If you like this video, make sure to share, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff. It is greatly appreciated. For one, it helps the channel, and one, this tells Google that our videos are worth watching and that you guys want to watch them. And so they boost us on the page and they start sharing our content more often. Not only that, but it also helps increase ad revenue. I know ads are annoying as hell. I agree. I hate running ads. For almost a decade, I didn't run ads for that very reason. But this money helps me to buy resources, to invest in better technology, to buy equipment like this microphone that I'm speaking on right now. And it helps me to make the channel better, which is a huge passion of mine. I really want to make this channel the best that it can be. Um, I've bought some lighting. I bought a green screen. There's so many different things that I'd like to do here in the next 6 months to a year. So if you'd like, please leave your likes and subscribes and comments down below. I really appreciate your time in watching this, and hope you have a good week. Take care.
Like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the ride. We're living online in the blink of an eye. Like, share, and subscribe. Come and join the